Okay, so today's talk is partly about Jean-Baptiste. It's also partly about some data that relates to the question of whether trade and war, or at least conflict between states, is negatively related. It was Say's view that they would be, and so I thought it would be interesting to take a look at what some of the data has been. There is a literature in international relations, political science, sometimes called Capitalist Peace, and that was the title of one of the articles back in the field. So the question is that Say tried to examine is the relationship between trade and international peace. And that's the sort of theme that I want to work through. So let's begin with Say, a few things about Say himself. First, his picture. This was the nicest picture I could find of him. There are some other ones which are quite frightening in a way. I don't know whether they're true, but I choose to believe that this is really what Say looked like. So there he is, and a few things to say about him that maybe some of you don't know. He's a rather heroic figure in my view. He came out with the first edition of his treatise on political economy in 1803, and at that time Bonaparte was part of the government. He wasn't the dictator, the emperor that he had become, but nevertheless he was quite influential. And so either he or one of his people called Say, the book had sold pretty well, and asked Say, demanded that Say change parts of the book to rationalize or justify Bonaparte's view of a command economy, basically. And Say refused. He got thrown off a committee that he had been on that was designed to discuss new legislation, and eventually was either exiled or felt it was in his best interest to go to a small town in the north of France to invest and operate a cotton mill, which was successful for a number of years. But then he had problems with his partners, but anyway, he survived Napoleon, and he was also, by the way, offered 40,000 francs a year to change the book. I'm not sure that what 40,000 francs was in those days, but it seems to be that it was a lot of money. But he refused all that, and then when Napoleon was gone, he issued the second edition of his book, and then further editions through his lifetime. So one must admire the man, at least for that, aside from the contributions he made to economics. Form, Say's view of the interrelationship between peace and trade. Peace is necessary for industry, for commerce, for exchange, but peace itself creates interrelations that produce dependence of the parties upon each other, leading therefore from peace to trade to peace to more trade and to peace again. So I call it Say's virtuous circle. That's the very simplified view, but it gets a little bit more detailed. So as I say, peace allows markets to develop. The growth of markets spreads the division of labor and specialization, an idea he got from Smith. And all of this leads to increasing wealth. Now, at the same time as wealth is increasing, Say believed the cost of war would increase. The direct cost of war would increase because greater wealth and technological improvements lead to more destructive weapons. So that's the direct cost. But one of Say's contributions, and one of the earliest uses really of the opportunity cost concept, was that the real cost of war, or the most important cost of war, aside from the destruction of human life, was the opportunity foregone of wealth creation. So as an economic system becomes more prosperous, two things happen. The direct costs of war increase, but also the opportunity costs of war increase. Now, Say believed that the spread of markets through free trade between nations would increase the stake that nations have in peace. Because the opportunity cost of war, again, is the lost mutual gains from trade. So this was going to be, in Say's view, an important factor in the coming century, early 19th, so the coming 19th century, that would make for peace. The law of markets, sometimes known as Say's law, but the law of markets in this context meant for him, the richer your trading partner, the greater your own gains from trade and vice versa. In other words, this was direct opposition to the mercantilist or the cobertisme of the French government and the English government. Instead of beggar thy neighbor, Say urges, prosper thy neighbor. The more prosperous your neighbor is, the more he can offer you in trade and vice versa with you. So prosperity of everyone, in a sense, creates prosperity for everyone. Now, there was more to it, and this is an interesting point for our thoughts today, especially. He thought that political economy was a moralizing influence. There's an interesting statement that Say makes in an early book on a sort of utopian society. I think it's called Eale, or I'm not sure, I can't remember the name, but it's about a utopian society. And in that book, there's an interesting sentence. He says, the first book of ethics must be a good treatise on political economy. Now, what does he mean? Well, what he means is if you understand the law of markets and you understand that other people's gain is your gain, or can be your gain, sort of a moralizing influence occurs in society. We no longer look at each other quite as much as enemies, but now as cooperators, as friends in effect, or if not friends, at least as cooperators. And so he believed that the greater the public awareness of the direct and opportunity costs of war, greater the public awareness, the more people would come to hate war. But this had to take place, he thought. The two requirements that he thought were important was, first, the education of the public. He thought it was very important to write political economy for the general public, as well as for scholars or experts. He also thought it was important that there be more and more representative governments, because if the people were well educated in the costs of war, that would really do no good, or at least minimal good, unless the government would be responsive to what the people wanted. Now, he believed that representative institutions would spread precisely because the industrious classes, meaning virtually everybody but the government, the army, and some other hangers-on, as the industrious classes became more important, became more the center of wealth creation, they would demand representation in government. And so representative government would spread as wealth increased, and as representative government spread with the increase in wealth, the demand for peace would spread, and therefore we would see an era of greater and greater peace. Finally, in this brief analysis of Say, I can't not mention that Say, as many of the French liberals, had a sense of class conflict. They saw that society was not simply an aggregation of well-meaning industrious farmers and artisans and other types of productive people. But he realized that a minority would actually benefit from war. Definitely a minority, and this minority consisted of colonial monopolists, those who receive monopoly rights to trade in the colonies, arms manufacturers, the higher ranks of the military, not the ordinary soldier, the nobility, and vain leaders like Bonaparte. So there was this class conflict, but as the strength of the growing middle class and industrious classes increased, he felt that these special interests would be overcome. Okay. Is then peace produces markets. Markets produce gains from trade. These gains from trade are people become increasingly aware of them and their connection with markets. And this awareness leads people to demand a greater say in the government, or representative government, which then responds to the people and produces peace. Now this is so good in some way that you say, well, how war is impossible, right? He proved it, QED. Okay, it's true that, say, in many of the early, or even later 19th century liberals had a kind of real optimism about the future, and that's not even the restricted case of French. I mean, it's kind of the legacy, I guess, of the Enlightenment of the 18th century. You know, things are getting better, right? The nobility is cracking. The industrious classes are moving ahead, and things will get better. And there will come a day in which war will be obsolete. In fact, I think it was Say who predicted the end of colonies by he said before this century is out. So he was a little off there. All right. So now what I want to do is I want to survey a very small portion of the literature that has been directed to answering the question. It's sometimes phrased as the question of liberal peace. The connection between trade, and then I'll later talk about democracy, connected with Say's representative government idea, and peace. So my purpose is not to present a definitive test of Say. I don't think that's possible. The literature is not clear enough. There are a lot of data problems. But simply I want to suggest by presenting enough data in hopefully a friendly, enjoyable, South of France way, that will say to you, this is something worth studying. You know, this is something, it's not just Say's over optimism about the future, but it's something that maybe is worth studying today. So I want to go to some early empirical work. In the early empirical, this is all work mostly by a man by the name of Polacek and some of his co-authors. But this work goes back quite a while now. And one of the earliest pieces was from 1978. If anybody's interested in the actual references, you can just email me and I'll give them to you. In 1978, he did a single equation cross-section analysis. Okay, trying to number of variables, size of the economy, things of that sort, trying to see if there was an association between trade and conflict. Now let me clarify here something about this data, right? The first thing is the word conflict means a lot more than just war. In fact, wars, especially among developed nations in the period of time that we're talking about here, which is the last, say, 30 or 40 years, are not that common. So you're not going to have that many observations. So political scientists have developed a measure which they sometimes call militarized interstate disputes. And it includes things like a dispute with at least one battle casualty. So one soldier gets killed or something. That's a dispute. Threats between countries. Massing of troops along borders. Or some general use of force. So flying maybe a plane or a helicopter over another country's land. Things of that sort. Okay, so it's a fairly broad conception of disputes. The second thing is that in most of these studies, what they're studying is dyads. Okay, and what that I mean is we're studying the relationship between trade and conflict between two countries. So it's not just trade conflict on the one hand, but they're trying to connect, right, the trade with a country and conflict with the country. So it's fairly thought out, but as I say, there are lots of problems in the data, and that's why I'm only saying this is suggestion. Anyway, the first thing is that the first study showed that a 10% increase in trade is associated with a 1.5% decrease in conflict. Then Polachek said, well, we have to worry about causation working in both directions, right? Peaceful countries may say, well, you're so nice, let's trade. Or is it we're trading because it's to our advantage, and now we think, oh, I guess you weren't so bad after all. So there's that problem. So we did a two-stage least squares cross-section analysis in 1980 to account for the effect of conflict on trade in this way of mutual causality. And here he found that a 10% increase in trade decreases conflict by 3.5%. So things are getting a little bit stronger. In 1982, he and a co-author, Polachek and a co-author, did a study of Warsaw Pact conflict with the United States between 1967 and 1978. And here, what he did was, he said that contemporaneous trade, let's say not lagged trade, not trade a year or two before, but contemporaneous trade explains 33% of the variance in 67-75 Warsaw Pact conflict with the U.S. So since there wasn't a war between the Warsaw Pact and the United States, so this is these threats, these are the massing of troops or getting things on alert or things of that sort. He thought that the 76-78 didn't fit so well, and he gives some excuses for that. I'm not going to go through his excuses. It seems like it's just that, excuses. But it fit for at least part of the period, suggesting a constant elasticity of response. One interesting finding, which is not clear from the data I put up, is that the trade seemed to have a much stronger effect on moderating Warsaw Pact behavior than U.S. behavior. And this is an important issue, and it may account, I'm sure somebody's going to want to bring up Ukraine and Russia. It may account for sometimes the fact that there's a differential impact of trade. Why would it be the case that there's a much stronger effect on the Warsaw Pact than on U.S. behavior? And one possibility that he suggests is that the gains from trade were greater for the Warsaw Pact nations than for the U.S. And this is an important theme which is going to come out in further work. it's not really the level of trade that is the relevant variable, although it's the easiest one to measure. It's the gains from trade. So that, for example, if one country is trading a lot with another, but that one country has good alternative opportunities to buy what they want from elsewhere, it's not going to, the gains from trade are not going to be as great, right? On the other hand, if a country has is kind of locked in and has very poor opportunities, while the other country has good opportunities. In other words, I can sell my stuff lots of different places, but you can only really buy from me. Then there's asymmetrical gains from trade, and you would think that one country would be impacted more than the other on the trade dependency. All right. But that at that point was just a speculation. Back to the question of causality. This is quite important. Polacek performed Granger causality tests on the U.S. Warsaw Pact data. And the test was whether past values of trade affect present values of conflict. And he said, his conclusion was that Granger causality for short lag periods runs overwhelmingly from trade to conflict and not from conflict to trade. Now, more recently, what some people have done is run regressions for each dyad separately. That is to say, United States with umpteen other countries, or Russia with umpteen other countries. So the study that's been done here was study the relationship of conflict and trade between the United States and 115 countries between 1948 and 1978. Now, if the theory is correct, the dyads should show a negative slope, and the general that straight line shows the general trend. But you can see that there are some upward slopes in the relationship of the United States to other countries with respect to trade and conflict. And so this made Polacek and others think about this issue I just raised, differential gains from trade. Maybe in some cases you don't get the expected relationship because the gains from trade are not very great in some relationships. The opportunities to find alternative sources of demand or supply are great in some cases. So trade level is an imperfect proxy. And the gains from trade are greater for any given level of trade the more inelastic the demand or supply curves are. Unfortunately, supply elasticity data was not available, at least in any usable form, when they did this study in 1992. Now, a lot of numbers here, but I just want to say that one interesting fact is that when they try to measure dyad trade elasticity using only elasticity of demand on each part, so for the other country, they didn't have the elasticity of supply, you get a fairly high relationship. In fact, a 10% more inelastic demand proxy for greater gains from trade is associated with a 4.7% lower conflict. But they show that holding elasticity constant, that a doubling of imports leads to a 50% reduction in conflict, and a doubling of exports leads to a 30% decline in conflict, which are some serious numbers. All right. Now, remember, in the original statement of Say's analysis, I said that in the more complicated circle, one of the factors was representative government. And there are many theories that have been summarized. Democracies rarely fight each other. And the question here is it something about democracies, representative government, that makes for less conflict with other democracies? One hypothesis is that in a representative government, more people have to approve of the conflict. Though, as a citizen of the United States, I don't see many people having to approve of what Obama says when he's going to bomb someplace. So, I don't know. Maybe there's an implicit constraint that, if he said, we're going to send a nuclear weapon to Mexico City, that somebody might say something at that point. So there may be some constraints. But in any event, let's assume that there are constraints that are greater in representative governments than there are in other kinds of government. The interesting thing is that constraint theory should tell us that democracies fight less or have less conflict also with non-democracies, because the constraint is operating on them too. And apparently that's not the case, according to the data that I've seen. Nevertheless, there are political scientists and international relations experts that believe that the issue is democracy, and that they would say this, that democracies also trade more with each other. So here again, we don't know how to separate out the causality. So Polacek and Eale in 2007 decided to take this on, and what they did was they introduced trade into regressions with a measure of democracy or representative government. And when they controlled for the size of the economy, the coefficient of democracy becomes statistically insignificant. The data, measurement problems, and things of that sort. But it's not as if people haven't tried to sort out the effect between trade and democracy, the connection between trade and democracy, and the connection between the two-way causality between trade and peace. These are things that there have been some efforts to separate out and to try to isolate really what the more important causes were. Now we know that from Say's analysis, Say would probably claim that it's democracy and trade. Interestingly enough, in keeping with the general classical liberal philosophy, public understanding, rightly understanding your true interests was important. People would only understand, right? If they only understand that it's not beggar thy neighbor, it's prosper thy neighbor. People would only understand the benefits of peace. So public understanding, and therefore, and then through that, influence on government was extremely important. The public choice world has taught us to poo-poo that. To say, well, and what the people think, this is just rationalizations, words, whatever. But Say didn't think of it in those terms. He really felt that enlightenment would work, and enlightenment would also then affect government and representative governments and their policies. So for say, it probably would have been the same thing. Both factors would have been important. All right. Now another scholar, Gartsky, in 2007, developed a somewhat different hypothesis. He said, I don't think it's really trade that is, in and of itself, the most important factor. So I think it's really a broader sense of financial and monetary integration of some sort. In other words, countries that don't have capital controls, capital going out, countries that are interrelated in terms of financial markets, countries that have a certain degree of dependence in terms of their monetary policies. So while he didn't think that trade was irrelevant, he thought that trade was in some sense a proxy or covering the real issue or the real factor, which was capital and monetary integration, greater or lesser degree of integration. So when he included this additional variable, he found that neither trade nor democracy are statistically significant variables in determining militarized interstate disputes. And here he gives there's an interesting diagram. This is the relative risk of militarized interstate disputes based on certain variables: democracy, development, affinity of interests. He measures some of that by the yakking in the UN, and things of that sort. And markets. Markets for him means largely this financial integration, which is going to be correlated with trade probably. So it's kind of a catch-all. And so on the horizontal axis, you start out with the maximum values in the data of these variables: the most democracy, the most development, the most harmony of interest, the most markets. And then you successively go to lesser and lesser amounts to the minimum. And you see, as you get to lower and lower amounts, that the relative risk of a militarized interstate dispute rises. And markets seem to be really the key factor. Harmony of interest is interesting in that sort of up to a certain point, it doesn't matter if you disagree. But when disagreements, when the harmony of interest becomes low, you go to the minimum, so interests become less harmonious. After a certain point, it really matters. And that's probably consistent with intuition, right? Minor disagreements, you're not going to, but then when they get a lot and frequent, it really matters. But democracy is the interesting thing. It's just sort of there, a little bit of an influence, but other things seem to be, even the level of development, all of these things seem to be much more important than democracy. All right. So, Say thought that increased trade and appreciation of global markets, spread of representative government would make war much less likely, perhaps even obsolete. I try to put Say maybe in a slightly better light than I should have or would if I were being perfectly accurate, because I think he truly believed this would make war obsolete completely. I think that given what we've seen, it's probably better to interpret his idea as make it less likely, reduce the probability in some sort. Now, that relates to an important point. You know, these kinds of statistical econometric I don't know, when you do statistical work in political science, you call it polymetric or something, I don't know. But anyway, this kind of work, you know, is aggregated work. It has to do with probabilities. So now when I kept worrying over the last few days, somebody's going to ask me to, you know, to be the expert on Ukraine, Russia. And I have a little something to say, but don't push me too far because I don't know much. But the point is this has to do with probabilities. So it's hard to, when you know, that's kind of a thick explanation of Russia, Ukraine, United States. It's going to depend a lot more on factors which maybe in the aggregate are not as important, are going to maybe seem more important in this particular case, but that's consistent with really any statistical analysis, right? There are always outliers, there are always exceptions, things of that sort. So I'm trying to give you the sweep of it rather than to be able to explain every case. But the data are suggestive that trade indeed makes conflict less likely, but probably not to the extent that Say and his followers thought. Now, to show that this was not only Say's view, Cobden and Bright and other Englishmen who were arguing for the end of the corn laws in Britain, the tariff on goods, referred to Cobden, who famously referred to commerce as the great panacea. It would make international relations peaceful, made war obsolete. Well, that idea was running through even in Britain. But it may not be that, but at least I think this data seems to show that it may well be an important causal factor in reducing international conflict. So I think Say is worth studying, not just because I'm here in Aix-en-Provence, but I think the data by non-Frenchmen indicates that probably is the case. Thank you very much.